What's going on? What's going on, everybody? Everybody? Hang on a sec. I gotta take care of that. That was intense. What's going on, everybody? Super Tuesday. Oh, this one? Yeah, this one too. Okay. It's a good thing these are finished being developed. We've got to finish up some deciduous work, and this is also a tree that we've seen on Mirai Live before. This is a hedge maple, Acer campestre, field grown by Randy Knight originally, and a very, very powerful tree, incredibly powerful tree. Now, we set the structure, we did some styling, we worked on approach grafting on the tree initially when we did it on the stream. We have not proceeded any further with the carving because we wanted to allow the tree to naturally kind of deteriorate, decay, rot. We just let this thing ultimately do what it was going to do this year, and it really paid off. Compared to where it was when we initially started this design process, this tree at this point in time has just grown leaps and bounds in terms of quality and the continued sort of evolution of its shape and its form. Okay, now first things first, one of the things that we really don't talk about very often is how do we maintain deciduous trees, especially as we get moss accumulating. Do we clean the trunk? How do we handle them? And this is an important thing. You can see as the winter time is coming on, we get a major moss accumulation on the trunk. And if we're dealing with smooth bark deciduous trees, there is kind of a light roughness to the bark of hedge maple. We can always use a nice soft nylon bristled brush just to come back in, especially if that moss or that trunk is nice and damp. And you can see it just takes that moss off without doing any damage to the bark underneath. Now, I'm not aggressively scrubbing, but I am going ahead and just cleaning this of all of this adhering moss so that we do preserve the characteristics. Is the moss going to hurt it? No, not necessarily, right? But when we talk about these thin bark trees, part of the beauty of the thin bark deciduous model is getting to see that kind of unobstructed, really nice transition to see the swelling and muscling of the vascular tissue along the trunk and the branch collars. And so the moss really starts to mute and take away a lot of that appreciable beauty that happens in that smooth bark. And it's wise, nice, and a part of routine kind of maintenance to come through and just brush off some of that moss so that we eliminate its kind of hold on the bark. We go ahead and clean that trunk. And I'm just going to do this before we even start, because really tonight when we talk about this scope of work, we've done kind of the primary selection of trunk, major branches and primary branching emerging from the trunk. We've done the secondary sort of transition and shift of that secondary scaffolding to bring about a little bit more authentic deciduous model to a Japanese maple. We worked hard on the trident maple last week in terms of really dissecting that tertiary pruning, the strategy that goes into it. Now we're at a point where we get to dive into and mesh all of those worlds together. And I will say this, I am doing this work what I would consider to be a little bit later than I would typically like to be doing this work. And consequently, when I do this work on this tree, it's gonna have to go into the greenhouse because we are kind of past that point where we still have those sugars and starches moving and reallocating through the tree. As a result, this pruning will impact this tree's winter hardiness tonight, just based on the fact that we're a little bit late. We're gonna be taking away all the hormonal concentration at the tips that we prune. It loses its navigation system, and therefore it starts to exert or actually empty out the stored sugars and starches in its vacuole, or that cellular structure, and lose the capacity to be able to tolerate winter conditions, right? So when we hit it too late, this tree's been without leaves. You'll notice there's no leaves. I guess there's a few in the pot still, but there's no leaves on the tree. These dropped, the sugars and starches with the reabsorption of that pigment have been distributed, and now we're at a point where when we open it up, right, we're going to have to protect because the tree is going to have to compartmentalize, and it uses those stored sugars and starches to do so, okay? But the beauty of this is that we've already done that primary structure, we've already done that secondary scaffolding, and so we've let it grow to really kind of experience the fruits of the labor and effort that we've put into it already in terms of allowing most of this to really mature and thicken and start to give us a proportion that feels like it is reflective of the size and scale of this tree. So tonight's work is going to be tempering some of those areas where we've allowed that big thickness, that big, really rugged growth to occur, talking about campestre specifically in terms of the orientation and our strategy behind the cuts and evolution of its ramification, and really just talking about this build-out effect of where we set that structure, we let it blow out. We prune it back, we set that secondary, we let it blow out. Each time gaining a little bit more beef, a little bit more mass, a little bit more girth, and enhancing all of those components so that when we get to this point and we start to prune back, we're really thinking on that tertiary level, but we're also going to be manipulating some of that structure, some of that secondary, some of that tertiary to fully move into that confident sort of push towards a more refined version of the Acer campestre, okay? So I'm just gonna kind of get a little bit of a vibe, as I typically do. I'm gonna start on this lowest branch here, and definitely when I see this, to show the tree for the scale that it has the ability to represent, we recognize that it is gigantic, right? It has really been allowed to grow, taken that liberty, okay? And when I dive in here, I wanna be really clear about pruning Acer campestre, because campestre is not different from other maple species, but does differ a little bit from, I would say, the Trident and Japanese maple model because it has a dependable shift of orientation. Okay, opposing orientation, meaning you have two buds next to each other here. Let me go ahead and just look right in front of my scissors there. You've got those two buds. Okay, and as I move out, instead of those two buds being lateral, they switch to up and down or vertical orientation, and then lateral again, and then vertical again. Okay, so when you start to look at that, when I'm pruning back, I'm really not going to be. We talked about the Trident maple. We said, listen, you're going to get this big elongated internode. You're going to pinch that back. It's going to stimulate the finer internode on the interior. And that's really going to be the internode that contributes to that ramification. When we deal with campestre, and when we deal with campestre that's been this evolved, right, where we have this kind of branch quantity, I am very happy to cut back to those two laterals and really start that process, because with the number of ramified pieces of growth on this tree at this point in its development, we don't have to worry about that first flush being overly aggressive or creating internodes that are going to be unmanageable. In fact, it will be relatively fine in terms of the growth based on the fact that we've accumulated so much branching. And this is really where we start to break down and understand each maple species is going to offer us a different opportunity and a little bit of a different nuance to how we build that ramification. Knowing that that nuance exists is how you can start to even be aware, potentially observe, understand, and learn how to maximize the growth habit of those pieces, okay? Now inside of this, when we get into, and I got a little broken branch here, let me go ahead and take that off. Okay, when we get into campestre, one of the things that we recognize is we get towards the base here and we have some very tight internodal lengths immediately at the base of these branches here. And you can see just these little leaf scales right here. That little band right there is a leaf scale. Just above it, just 1/8 of an inch, maybe even less than 1/8 of an inch above it, we have another internode band or another internode junction. And then suddenly that thing spaces out, this big massive internode, and it shoots out. In these instances, when I'm cutting back, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to leave both of those internode bands right there. Okay, because when we talk about campestre and getting the best possible production of buds, one of these two is going to produce. We don't know which one. I'm going to leave both of them since they're so tight. And even if it's the outer one that produces, I'm no worse for wear because it's only 1/8 of an inch that I gain. This becomes a nuance of field maple specifically in terms of how we get that best, most ramified growth. And I'm going to see that consistently. Even to the degree when we get in here to these smaller pieces, I have a little junction here, I have a very tight internode, I have another very tight internode, and then it leaps. I'm happy to keep those tight internodes and keep all of them intact, generate leaves on this tail end, and potentially even get branching to form behind that when we do the post-flush harden, partial defoliation, and prune. But for these pieces where I have these big elongated internodes and I see these opposing buds being laid out laterally, I'm happy to cut back to those. I'm not apprehensive to cut back to those like we talked about last week with the Trident maple, needing to really give ourselves almost a sacrificial pair of buds that we're going to either pinch or prune in the partial defoliation to push back the ramification to that much tighter interior and then have that diluted strength give us that finer ramification. We're pulling back on that idea when we're dealing with the campestre, okay? So just kind of stepping in here, right, and talking about the product and the fruits of our efforts, we know from what we talked about last week and in general about bonsai, and I referred to the California juniper stream that we did on the mini stream early on in the pandemic, the bigger the push with this tree having this kind of growth accumulation, the bigger the reduction, the bigger the push in terms of dissatisfying or I would say reducing the balance that's been achieved in the tree, the bigger the response the tree is going to have. So when we get into a lot of these bigger branches here, we have to understand that although these are still developing, although they're not perfect in their form, they are definitely valuable from the perspective of recognizing that if we cut these back, if we whack this thing back, if we really hack and take this to a significant degree of reduction, we will run the risk of this tree exploding and giving us a very big aggressive push of growth. And we don't want to stimulate that kind of growth, okay? So same thematics are coming through, a little bit of a nuance from the trident to the campestre or from the trident to a Japanese maple in terms of, recognizing that we are cutting back to lateral buds as opposed to preserving or trying to encourage a little bit more of a sacrificial growth and then understanding how we get that ramification to play out. But in general, right, we see the necessity and the desire to, at this point in the game, temper the degree and the severity to which we prune this so that we maintain the refinable growth. Okay, and I'm just going to work through this to regain the proportion. We'll talk about it aesthetically, and then we'll discuss what do we do with wire at this point in time with a deciduous tree to keep it moving forward, because the last thing we want to do is wire everything, but there are pieces that will need it. I'm going to open it up to questions as I finish this up.
Awesome. Well, first we've got Bentley. Bentley wants to verify real quick. Would Acer campestre thrive in Charleston, South Carolina, Zone 8B?
I think that Acer campestre does have an opportunity and probably would give you the ability to cultivate it in a condition like Charleston 8B. I don't know for sure, Bentley, but it does feel, and they are very, very durable, vigorous, and I would say adaptable species of maple compared to some of the more delicate or challenging or sensitive varieties like the Japanese maple, which can be a little bit of a tougher go when you go into warmer climates. I feel like campestre gives you that flexibility, and I like campestre for all of the durability it provides. It's a very, very strong species of maple.
All right. Nathan wants to know, would a vinegar spray do well for removing moss that grows on the trunk and branches?
A vinegar spray would do pretty well, but here's the thing, and this is what I was talking about earlier. If you have a thin bark tree, and when we talk about, say, the rough bark maple, or any sort of cork bark elm, or even elm in general that does tend to have a little bit more flaky bark, when we deal with these thin bark trees, the cleaning process is so effortless and easy with that coarse kind of nylon brush that I was using that I don't really see a necessity to deal with vinegar, and vinegar does take a little bit longer. We tend to find vinegar be a lot more valuable when we're dealing with a much more valuable thick bark that we can't scrub, that we don't want to damage, that we would be remiss to knock off. That's really when vinegar on a pine, on our conifers, and on our rougher bark deciduous varieties, that's when we typically see that be more applicable. On a campestre, on a Japanese maple, on a trident maple, using that nylon brush to get rid of some of that moss, completely and totally acceptable.
All right. Up next is LA David. They said they air layered a Japanese maple in spring of last year. It's been very successful, lots of roots. Due to medical issues on work, they hasn't done well in the separation yet. They're in coastal Los Angeles. Should I wait until spring at this point, or can I go ahead now, 100% Akadama?
No, I think you can go ahead now. I think you're actually at the best time to be separating it, and I'd encourage you to go for it.
Awesome. Up next is Treebeard Steve. Just a clarification, this will overwinter in an unheated greenhouse, or will there be supplemental heat?
Unheated greenhouse, but we won't, not an unheated greenhouse, supplemental heat. We won't be letting this get too warm because it would push prematurely, but we're going to keep it from freezing, Steve. So we're going to try to keep it right around that 38, 40, 42 max, which is an ideal, right? It is an ideal. Whether or not we can actually hold the greenhouse there, that's what matters, okay? All right, I'm going to pause on questions for a second. I'm just going to walk you through because we have this first branch pruned, and I really do like the proportion that this starts to establish. This piece is dominated by this big authentic. This is very, very authentic for a field maple. If you see them sort of in the greater environment, has kind of the appearance of a big oak, but really does give us this big kind of size, scale, proportion that has some of the power of the species in it. And I love this, but this branch on the foreground here has always been a really appealing branch to me, growing off of the shoulder, not at risk of causing inverse taper because it plays into this really big structural piece here. But as we get into this, we start to realize that this cannot be one big, huge pad. This is not good deciduous design for this piece to be one large kind of singular foliar mass. And it's inside of this now that we start to seek this maturity, that we can start to create informalities, right? The structure is done. We did this together on the stream and really had, I think, a really positive impact on the way that the structure has these lines put into it and has matured over the course of time to thicken into that. But now these secondaries, getting these secondaries to really diversify, creating some that come down, some that come up, and starting to offset some of that unified growth that we created initially, this is the maturation process of deciduous bonsai design. Okay, so not going back in and attempting to wire every single piece, but coming back in and really starting to utilize my secondaries to break up that distribution and create irregularities, that becomes the next stage. And this is a really awkward moment in bonsai design because we are so indoctrinated and so, I think, geared towards and constantly reinforced that you've got to flatten the pad, flatten the pad, flatten the pad to give definition. Well, this is to apply the coniferous concept to the deciduous form, not necessarily giving rise to the best deciduous aesthetic. And in fact, I would say not creating complete chaos across the branching, but definitely working to offset and create some organic differentiation is what allows us to get that kind of billowy, tufted effect through our finer ramification at this point in time. And so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to apply what I would call sort of the definitive notions of branch division versus a break in a singular pad, okay? Because when we start to talk about branching and wiring and we have a pad, if you want this branch to look like a softer version, maybe the bottom line is super hard, right? And that's a big, big foliar mass, okay? We perform one of three techniques, okay? Either we break it up by front to back, changing that position. Maybe we break it up by side to side, creating a space between them. Or maybe we break it up top to bottom to give that hard line across the bottom of that pad a little bit of differentiation and softening. Now, this is not two pads. This is still one pad where we've softened the hard, constant, inorganic line of that flat bottom and that moment of definition. Boom, one action, boom, one action, boom, one action, okay? Now, when we talk about creating two pads out of that foliar mass that is originating as one, to give the kind of break and space that represents two different, authentic, independent pads, we have to apply two of those break or design concepts, okay? Front to back, top to bottom. Now we've got two pads, okay? Side to side, top to bottom. Now we've got two pads. Side to side, front to back. Now we have two pads, right? So when we think about this, if I start to look at this piece, just dropping one of these branches is going to be a soft break in that pad, okay? But if I drop one branch and I raise and laterally move another branch, now I create two separate billows inside of this singular piece. Now, this branch, this big thick branch, in terms of deciduous design, is giving us a sense of scale that this is a massive tree. And if it is a massive tree, we have to change the proportions of each individual pad or branch. I have one branch here. Across this tree, we have 12 structural branches. But to show this as a big, massive tree, those 12 structural branches need to represent 30 plus fundamental independent pads or billowy masses of deciduous fine ramification to show the kind of scale that makes this tree look like a big tree in miniature. And so part of the process when we get into this kind of deciduous design is really understanding how we go about dividing these singular structural pieces with all the secondary work that we've done to improve and enhance the design to be able to give rise to and a sense of scale in the eventual piece that we hope matures with that finer ramification. This is the big part of deciduous design that doesn't have a lot of dialogue behind it. How do you create a sense of scale? We talk about it in conifers. We know we try to refine the size of the twig in deciduous. We know we try to shrink down the size of the leaf in deciduous, but also in the styling and design process, we have this capacity to alter the interpretation of the billowy mass and its size and its position to equal a soft break or a hard break, and that hard break is what gives rise to multiple independent pads inside of a singular piece of primary structure, okay? So I'm gonna be working on that as a thematic of tonight's design and discussion so that we hopefully do get to a point where we start to see this tree representing a much bigger, larger image by that distribution and that change of that proportion, right?
Ready for some more questions?
Definitely.
Awesome. Okay. Sarah says, wants to know if why would you forego the sacrifice bud on a trident or Japanese maple if it already had tons of ramification?
Would I forego? Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I guess if you put it that way, I kind of feel like I have to say yes. Let me think about that for a minute. Yeah, I would forego it, but also just bear in mind that if you forego that sacrificial piece and you've already got ramification, the first flush, even on the most refined form of a deciduous, is always going to be a little bit coarser than you actually want. And so you have to be careful to overassume. Like, I've got plenty of ramification, things are good, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to forego that opportunity, and then all of a sudden you get all of these big, coarse, elongated pieces of growth coming out of it next spring, and you're like, shoot, I screwed up, I lost that refinement. That's a really devastating thing to experience. But I think that there are always cases where we would forego that potentially. So I want to be clear, maybe I would.
All right. Up next is Rafi. Rafi says, if this tree had less branches and risk big internodes in the spring, what would be the pruning strategy given the alternating plane of buds?
Yeah, so I think this is really interesting because if you go back and you see all the work that we've done on this tree over the course of time, you would recognize that the initial design of this tree, the internodes were all incredibly long, right? And we went and we pruned it and wired it and did all of that work. And then we really let this tree just kind of grow. And the product of that pruning, the product of that distribution, the product of that design, after we let this tree grow following that work, is that at first we had some very, very serious growth, right? We have big, long internodes, big, coarse pieces of growth. But some of those pieces of growth from that initial prune had some very, very fine internodes and are giving us some really, really nice pieces to work with. And so just allowing, at times when we think about what it looks like to put a deciduous tree back into development, we tend to assume that we're going to get so much unusable growth that it's going to be almost impossible to regain it. And there are deciduous that will respond in that fashion. Acer campestre, not one of them. It is a very favorable, very agreeable species to creating shorter internodes, to creating nice tight interior buds a little bit more effortlessly after we reallocate from the tip to the interior and we make that prune and that transition to let it go. We will develop branching with very, very tight internodes as a result of that distribution of strength, okay? Let me talk to you about something here though, because we have some of these finer twigs that are existing in some of these regions, but we do have the developmental pieces that we allowed to really run, okay? And these developmental pieces, when we come back and we do this type of pruning, I'm very okay to take this back to a really nice fine, and let me go ahead and go a little bit tighter, really nice fine shoot here. I'll take that back right there, and that will form a really nice transition. I have another junction just behind it, but that's a relatively long internode. I don't want to prune this back to the base because that's just going to cause it to shoot from the base. It's going to cause that to adversely swell. I do have some buds at the tip here, and I can stimulate those, okay? Going back a little bit to the management of the growth at this time and how we handle it in the spring. Okay, but when I look at this piece right here, the same temptation to cut this short or to cut this almost to the same length as this piece right here, that exists, and I want to avoid that. I'm going to leave myself a little bit more secondary length here so that the way that I prune these two pieces staggers their length and allows me to have a little bit more of a differentiation. If these are the same length by the time I'm done pruning, you're going to sit and you're going to stare at that region. You're going to see, oh wow, that's really long, that's the same size, and it's going to look artificial. So always try to stagger those tips when you get those bifurcations at the tips, when you start to form those forks. Stagger those cuts. Be thinking about that. How do I use the inner node length? How do I shorten the inner node length? How do I stagger the length of my secondary to move into tertiary in a way that does give it a very organic appearance, okay? Another big part of a cutback after we grow out the fruits of our secondary scaffolding, be thinking about those components of that application.
All right, ready for some more?
Sure.
All right, Ludovic wants to know, can you pinch the bottom branches and keep the apex pushing to transfer energy to the top, but keep working on ramification on the bottom?
That is very, very tough to do, right? Because we do recognize, like up here, and one of the things that's happening, and I'll show you this right now, just so that you understand. Okay, Jesus, can you kind of shoot in here through those fine twigs and see what's happening here? Because this piece of, yeah, and pull back just a little bit, this piece, and go ahead and give me in here, Josh. Okay, this piece is something where we initiated the transition here, and there was a cut site here, okay? You see all that moss. Now, we opened this up with a big drill and with a little bit of crude carving, and then we just took our hands off of this piece, and you can see it's starting to rot and it's starting to deteriorate. I love this. I like the organic way that we can utilize time and we can utilize the natural deterioration of wood to be able to show and to be able to accentuate deadwood and the expansion of it, and really not try to artificially carve in a bunch of deadwood, but allow rot and the natural behavior of maple specifically, but a lot of our deciduous species allow that rot to give character, give rise to a natural character. Okay, so we started the process, we opened the wood up, and we created an area where water could definitely accumulate. And what we're consequently getting, as I just clean off this bark, is you see this big, beautiful callus forming right here. Big, beautiful callus, and we see that we're really getting a delineation of this tissue, and this is going to continue to deteriorate over the course of time. So instead of coming in and trying to carve this to look natural, the best thing I can do is continue to facilitate its rot, continue to allow water, to continue to allow the accumulation of resources. And in fact, if I wanted to hasten that, I could actually stuff sphagnum moss right inside of that and allow that interior to start to deteriorate and give rise to even further degrees of rot. But look at how nice that looks. And all I did was pull out. Okay, this is very, very solid around here. Now, there's some pithy stuff in here, but for the most part, we're going to have to let it continue to deteriorate. I like that naturalness to that. I'm willing to wait. We're building branching as we're going anyways. This tree is still quite a ways away from being a finished tree, and the artificiality of a lot of carving work does tend to spoil some of the nuances and the vibes. So those pieces on the upper portion of the apical region that are elongating, we can allow them to continue to go, but we've got to buffer how much they run, just circling back to the question that was answered, because they will suck the strength out of the lower branches, and we're now pushing these lower branches back pretty significantly.
Right. Jared wants to know, does Acer Genala, Amber Maple, compare to Acer Palmatum and Acer Campestre?
Amber Maple's a little bit tricky. A little bit more of a propensity to die back, a little bit fussier, doesn't respond the same way to pruning and partial defoliation as some of our other Acer species do. Still usable, doable. And the biggest thing that you have to focus on with Acer Genala is just making sure that you have branches continuing to conduct water to all portions of the tree. It is a species that if we rapidly decrease water flow to any area by the pruning process and by big heavy cutbacks, it tends to suffer by dieback of the tissue, okay? And I would say that's your biggest concern, that's your biggest focus, and that's your biggest piece of knowledge to successfully cultivate amber maple as a bonsai subject. But if you can do that, you keep them ramped up, you keep water moving to all components and portions of the tree, it does make a very good bonsai subject and can be very, very beautiful in its matured state. You don't see very many refined amber maples because of that characteristic, though.
All right, up next is Nathan. Nathan wants to know if you can show us the grafted branch that you added to the lower rear branch on the last tree.
You got it. You got it. Okay, let's see what we got here. Jesus, can you come right in here and take a good look at this piece? Yeah, and I'm going to go ahead and let me just see what I can do here. That's the one right there. Yeah, come in a little bit tighter for me, and let me get my arm out of there.
That's it.
That's it. It's maxed out. Okay, there it is, right across the top. You see it kind of healing. Relatively clean, relatively clean. Could have been slightly better. Over the course of the next 3 years, I could clean up this backside, carve down a little bit just with a razor blade, carve down the margins, and it'll further heal. But that's a nice, really nice strong branch that we grafted onto the interior, and that's going to allow us to do a lot with that piece. Okay, let me stay on point here over on this bigger branch, because this is really establishing a lot of my concepts for length and a lot of my concepts for shape. Okay, and you can see that we're starting to get this real craggly kind of vibe in this tree, and I want to continue to unify and work at getting this piece to evolve its aesthetic. So let's stay with the wire. I recognize where I need to have a little bit of a change in terms of the aesthetic and the position of some of these branches. And these have gotten big. This is a big scale tree. This still has some relatively heavy branching in it that we need to be working with. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to up my wire size just to be able to have total control over where I'm positioning the pieces that I'm working with, okay? And again, I want to be focused on how do I create that separation to give rise to that proportion that's going to make this tree feel visually like a much, much bigger tree, okay? And we recognize that obviously we want to avoid wire scars. We've been relatively successful having wired this multiple times to not have tremendous wire scars on the tree, and it would be a shame, an absolute shame, to lose that kind of quality that we've worked so hard for to this point in time. So again, one of the big ways that we kind of manage that at Mirai, we put it into our calendar, and once we get that alert, we go back, we check it, we see how it's going, and then after that point, if it's still not biting in or starting to get tight, then we'll come back on a weekly basis and kind of observe those branches to make sure that we don't have anything progressing to a degree where it's going to spoil all the hard work that we've done. Okay, now there's a natural kind of hierarchy that occurs in these branches, and Jesus, go ahead and come in tight here for me. Okay, notice how this piece right here starts out up high here. Pull back just a little bit for me, okay? Notice how the origin of this branch is a little bit higher than the origin of this branch, right? Yet this branch is hanging down below that. See how that's crossing that line in the design? This is one of those moments where bringing that up does tend to clarify a tremendous amount of that structure. It makes those lines a lot cleaner, a lot more transparent visually, and it also allows us to divide that piece, create that sense of scale between the two, and further that aesthetic that we were talking about, okay? These are all of those components when you allow a tree to just grow unchecked that you don't really have control over, and it starts to naturalize as a system on its own, probably dictated by the pieces that we're allowed to elongate. Now we've got to come back and we've got to give rise to a little bit more organization.
All right. Next question. I've got Leonard. Leonard says some of the branches you are pruning seem smaller in diameter than they should be to create proportional size. How long will it take for those thinner branches to thicken to the proper diameter to best serve the development?
Well, I think this depends, Leonard, because although we may have, and I want to be careful and diplomatic in the way that I answer this, although they may not be the size that we would expect from a traditional bonsai design sense, do we want to have everything be so very thick that it does look like a very formalized pine-style design? Or do you want to play with the fact that there are natural big transitions in deciduous trees and informalities in those transitions that I think are a little more authentic to the shape? And I personally am striving to play with scale tonight in terms of the design of this tree. I want to see the scale of this tree change. I want to see the scale of this tree increase its impression. And I think inside of that, having some smaller branches be those points that allow us to give an experience, as well as the division of the pads, a perspective and proportion that is maybe a little more authentic. I want to play with that. Okay, that's point number one. Here's number two. When we're building a deciduous tree, I think we do tend to think, okay, I'm going to build it to the exact size that I want, and then I'm going to cut it back and I'm going to start building branches. And we tend to think of it as a very robotic process. And I think there is an anticipated knowledge to how a deciduous tree will respond to different actions that does to a degree make it a robotic operation. However, right, inside of the operation, there's also the ability to kind of slowly but surely be building these components and starting to have the kind of changes and transitions that allow this to feel really organic and really natural. And so I'm happy to cut back branches that aren't the perfect size and focus the energy on the interior and enhance the number of secondaries that are going to push and then allow some of those to grow out. This is the exact same action. And again, I do encourage you to go back and see where this tree started. The exact same action that we performed initially in the design to give rise to all of these secondary branches was the cutback before all of these branches were so big. And it gave me more secondaries that could become scaffolding, eventually be allowed to grow as sacrificial, add leaf mass, thicken the structure. I cut it back. I'm going to get even more. I'm going to enhance that ramification and that expansion of that leaf mass. When we let that bulge again, we won't let it grow this much. We'll let it grow as a uniform mass and then cut it back. That's going to add more thickening. But it's just this gradual. Instead of trying to grow it out and be like, there, that's the branch I wanted. Now I can start cutting. Okay, I don't think that applies. I don't think that that is necessarily a smart decision in the creation of deciduous trees. A little bit more paste, a little bit more less black and white, and a little bit more organic in the way that we build that thickening, and I think you have a lot of benefit to what you get aesthetically from that operation. Okay, now ultimately when we designed this big branch originally, we kept on some of these big structural elements and we said, you know, we're going to leave them. But as these other pieces, which were quite small when we first started creating them, as these pieces gain more prominence, they gain more capacity to occupy the space. These pieces that we were kind of keeping because we didn't have really anything else, these can now be taken off. And this is really where we start to see some of this aesthetic improve dramatically. Okay, so I'm going to come back to that shoulder. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take that right at the collar of the branch and start to eliminate some of these pieces whose lines through the design really don't feel as if they're very beautiful or as if they contribute. Okay, and I'm happy to leave a little bit of a stub, allow that collar to establish itself, and then come back and cut back to the collar when we post-flush harden prune. But now you kind of see the clarity of that area. And that's really nice to get to experience. That's a rewarding thing that we've worked hard for to really see how that's going to be existing as a singular unit, okay? Last but not least, I'm going to be working on this lower piece. And you're seeing how we're pushing that back that proportion. You're seeing the scale of that branch start to show some of the fruits of our efforts. There might be a few little pieces in here that we need to adjust, and maybe I'll just go ahead, something like that. Okay, but I like this. I like where we're headed here. It feels very authentic, feels very natural, feels very... And you notice that I'm not over-organizing, I'm not over-wiring, I'm not over-styling. Okay, it is a deciduous, so I want to keep it that way. I want to keep some of that informality.
All right, up next we've got Sarah. Sarah is wondering if you would ever use the buds that are growing in the wrong direction as sacrificial buds, or is there some other reason why predictable alternating buds impact the technique?
Well, so these are opposing buds, first and foremost, just in case I misstated at some point in time, right? So the opposing buds are, in terms of an orientation, if you want things growing laterally as opposed to vertically and downward, which creates a strength discrepancy, that's why we always prune to a lateral bud. But as far as buds growing the wrong, oh, I see what you're saying. Oh, here we go. Okay. Wow, that just hit me right as I was talking. So what you're saying is, huh?
It said it's okay. We figured it out. There we are.
Yeah. So basically, I think what Sarah is saying is, okay, couldn't you use this vertical orientation when we start to look here, and you see this vertical orientation here, you have a lateral there, but that vertical orientation, couldn't you use that to potentially shoot off the top and gain more growth and strength and potential development? Yeah, I think that's really intelligent bonsai, Sarah. I think that's a really fantastic suggestion. Now, at this point in time, in this tree, we're kind of past the point that I want that. The second that we prune this back the first time and really influence the shape, we transitioned from the tip to the interior, and we allowed all those secondaries to grow. Now, they grew, and they grew, and they grew. We unwired those pieces and allowed them then to amass girth to repair the minimal amount of wire damage that occurred. And that's what you're seeing now with an abundance of twigginess and an improvement of thickness and transition of taper, okay? I don't want to, I think, induce that kind of thickening again. I'm slowing that progression as opposed to speeding that up. But like we said to the question earlier, we're still not totally there. And so we can continue to improve this. Every time we transition to the interior, we can allow the tree to push out with a nice healthy flush. It's going to take more years each time that we prune it to get the momentum ramped up to gain that thickening, but that's okay. That's okay, because I don't want anything to be super phenomenally thick at this point in time. Even the apical region, I'm not super interested in that becoming radically thick. Right? The top was lost, it's rotten, here are these advantageous shoots that push. That's a story to me. That's a story that has authenticity, a story I love to tell.
All right. Up next, we have Marianne. Marianne wants to know what size aluminum wire are you using?
Yeah, good question. I wish these had, I've been using, let's see, 3.5 on some of the intermediate sized branches. I'm guessing this is probably a 4.5 or maybe even a 5 that I'm using on some of these heftier branches, just to make sure that I have the capacity to move the branch wherever I want it to go. And ultimately, when we start to kind of look at the deciduous model again, I don't want to be hitting this tree with really, really big, heavy wire at this point in time. But sometimes when we let them go, when we let that explosion of growth occur after a big pruning event where we've transitioned the energy in the tree, you can get just that natural discrepancy or that natural orientation or the change of that branch's position in relation to the vigor that it's achieved and its necessity to find the light and the photosynthetic efficiency of the system. And so to come back, this is a branch that has a little bit of wire scarring because we clearly had to give it the same sense of rotation the last time that we wired it. We have a clockwise rotation on it. You can see a little bit of the marks in the branch here. Not bad. It's growing out of it beautifully. There is a recovery for soft bark trees when we get wire scars. It just takes time, right? But being able to continue that process, further reinforce that growth and that positioning that we initially started, that's a part of deciduous wiring and styling and design that we do have to work at and continue to perpetuate, because they do have a memory in their tissue. They do revert to their original position. They do need to be reminded periodically of where we're trying to move them in the evolutionary process of design.
All right. Up next is Zoda. Zoda says, how exactly does the alternating bud pattern affect your pruning decisions?
So I want to be sure we're talking about opposing bud pattern here, not alternating, right? Alternating means we would have buds on right, left. Here we have buds immediately apart from each other on all of our branching, okay? But I think what you're talking about is the orientation where we have lateral, vertical, okay? And what that means is I'm always seeking that lateral pair. That's honestly the big piece. So like here, I could prune this piece right here, okay? Bring me in tight, Josh, please. Yeah, I could prune this piece right here, and I've got verticals, and that's going to cause some of that vertical growth and downward growth that's going to cause a discrepancy. Or I can come back in and I can prune at a lateral right here. Have a much shorter internode, and typically, if these are handled correctly, the lateral is going to be the first internode that we're going to see, right? Now, this is still a relatively, if I extend that, you see that's still relatively coarse for this distance from the trunk. Both of these branches are relatively long and relatively coarse. I would like to see these get a little bit more refined, but here's the notion that we've got to be aware of. If I come back and I chop this big piece, this big coarse piece, if I chop that right now, let me get out of the way, boom, see that big thick piece? If I chop that back to these fine buds are going to be so long and so coarse because of that big reduction that I won't actually gain any more than I have in this elongated piece. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to cut back these tips, which should push these to grow or at least produce leaves in the spring, and then I can cut back to that. Again, similar to the trident model, but a little bit different from the perspective that it's not on the tertiary level. It's on the bigger the cut you make, the bigger the response the tree gets. I'm going to make small cuts here so that I get a small response, post-flush harden, partial defoliation, and prune. I can go back and I can refine that again. A mixture of those concepts. This one is all about controlling the cutback.
All right. Next question is from Leonard. Leonard says, once the rot forms character that you would want to save, could you add a hardener to those areas to freeze the deterioration in that place?
Absolutely. And in fact, I think that's the move, right? When we start to look at, okay, you're going to induce deterioration, maybe even facilitate it by packing moss in there. And if you wanted to go really far, you could actually put a decomposing fungi inoculant in there and further enhance the rapid decomposition. Okay, not many people talk about that. I've never heard that discussed, but this is something that I've seen done, that I've applied myself, and have seen it be very, very successful to actually introduce the culture that does start the deterioration and the decomposition of that wood, right? So these are things that we can play with that give us a little bit more natural appearance, that play on the natural behavior, and that allow us to tamper with that artificiality of an otherwise area that would demand that we come back in and we apply a power tool and potentially try to carve in the interest in that region of the tree. Again, if I can avoid it, I don't have any problem with carving, and if you're Will Baddeley or somebody that has that kind of talent, then amen, rock out, go for it, or hire Will, which I would happily do. But most of us don't have that capacity or the potential time or the knowledge of wood to be able to bring about those aesthetic improvements, and that's where we don't have to be handicapped by that. We don't have to be limited by the fact that we don't necessarily have the kind of acumen handling deadwood that allows us to impart some sort of really dramatic or interesting aesthetic on the tree. We can allow the tree to carry the weight, and it's just about patience, and it's about technique, and it's about awareness of the behavior of the wood, right? Even the most hardwood deciduous trees rot from the core out, okay? Whether we're talking about an oak, whether we're talking about, big leaf maple, whether we're talking about any other chestnut, right? We're talking about these hardwoods that we value a lot, hickory, right? These are still rotting from the inside out. And that means that we can take advantage of that by opening up the interior and by influencing that via the conditions that we create in the interior to allow that to start to deteriorate.
All right. Up next is Rafi. Rafi says, what is the front that you have in mind for this tree? I feel that the big hollow needs to be seen, but then you have the huge branch on the opposite.
Yeah, I'll show you the front. It was what we started with, which I think gives you a diagonal view of the big hollow at the base, which I really, really like. I think that hollow is magic. Troy did some deadwood work on that initially, and now we're allowing it to continue to evolve and advance. So I still feel, pretty compelled for the original front to maintain its capacity as the original front. Let me go ahead and get through the wiring of this piece. And again, I'm not trying to unify these pieces back here. I am trying to adjust the position, but I am also trying to create multiple different levels and pads, not within a singular fork or a singular bifurcation, but multiple pads within this piece in the rear so that I have that division. Billowy mass, billowy mass, billowy mass. I've got 3 billowy masses back here that I can start to lean on and maybe even just clean up a little bit more. Let me clean it up a little bit more, and then I'll show you that front.
Right. Ludovic wants to know, how many times in the growing season can you prune?
It depends on the season where we live in the Pacific Northwest, honestly. If we're having a warm summer, we can partially defoliate and prune at least once, if not 2 times, but very rarely do we have the heat to get us to 3 times. In warmer areas of North America, Europe, etc., you can fertilize aggressively, and if you have enough heat, you can push a little bit harder, and you might be able to get through 3 prunings that can give you a really significant step down of energy. That's where you start to see deciduous or our broadleafed evergreens take on that next level of aesthetic, okay? And we see that in the tropicals of, say, the Philippines or of Taiwan, where they have this tremendous ramification, okay? So here's what I've done. I've created, and now we can see a little bit more. Let me just go ahead and drop that out. And come on in close for me there, Josh. To Jesus's, yeah, there we go. Okay, so now you see here, and now we have this pad in the back. 3 billowy masses, independent. Let me go ahead and rotate for you. Okay, there you see that change of elevation, lateral, vertical, right? We start to see those pieces. That gives rise to scale through this piece, and we're starting to see just the finer ramification beginning to form. You notice these finer branches on the interior here, really nice, tiny little pieces that are starting to give that twigginess. We're just beginning to accomplish some of that aesthetic. Okay, now, one of the other things that we talk about in natural deciduous design is this notion of generational branching. And this little piece down here has such a significant commentary to be made on the fact that this tree grew up, the apex really matured, and then over the course of time, because the apex grew up, lower branches got weak, probably died. Sunlight recontacts that lower portion of the tree. It stimulates new growth to form from the trunk, and that new growth forming from the trunk creates a very small, fine branch at the base. Right? This kind of narrative arc is very, very natural, very, very common. This is something that Dave DeGroot used to talk about a lot in the compositions that he was creating initially at the Pacific Bonsai Museum up in Federal Way. And it was a concept that I thought about a lot because keeping that small, right? There's a discussion like, don't you want to thicken these branches? Don't you want them to be proportional? I mean, yes, to a degree. But there's also a narrative around branches that are maybe too small or even intentionally too small that give rise to an aesthetic. So when we rotate this around and you kind of look back at that small little branch back in there, that's kind of interesting. In fact, I think it's very, very interesting. And here's the front that I was talking about that has the hollow kind of offset to that 4 o'clock location. You get that little kind of twinkle of growth back from the back, gives you depth. And we're starting to see the design evolve, right? Starting to see it come together.
All right. Up next is Sarah. She wants to thank you for all your patience in teaching her. And she just wants to clarify one more time. You're not leaving the sacrifice buds on this tree because it already has so many branches, or is there something specific about the species and the fact that it has opposing buds?
Yes, I'm not leaving the sacrifice branches on this tree because Acer campestre doesn't produce the same elongated, vigorous growth as a Japanese maple or a trident maple would. So I'm not as concerned about the first growth being unusable. And in fact, and this is what I was saying when we talked about the initial work that we did to transition the energy from the tip to the interior, when we wired it the first time, most people would say, hey, don't go and prune those. They're not of the appropriate shape, or excuse me, they're not of the appropriate size. You're setting the tree back. And I'm saying, hey, if I prune the tips of these when I initially styled, just like we talked about in the structural pruning of the Japanese maple, we make those initial decisions, we take off those big structural branches, we rectify those flaws, and I even cut back some of those smaller branches. And I said, listen, the motivation, people think you have to let these grow. You're going to get big, huge internodes. You're not going to stimulate interior branching. And when we cut those tips back, at that point in time, we are making a commitment to interior branching, interior ramification, and more secondary scaffolding being stimulated to grow. The product of that, when you see this, all of these branches that are growing has enhanced and increased the rate that this tree has thickened, has developed, has evolved from the initial styling to what it is now, 2 years later, 3 years later, is phenomenal progression for a deciduous tree without the necessity for big, huge wounds, big cuts, big scars, and all of that stuff. It's all been very well paced, based on the physiology. Expanding the number of branches expands the number of leaves, expands the rate that those leaves allow the tree to thicken, right? Through the production of sugars and starches. It's a different mentality than this big, huge sacrificial branch growing habit that we've kind of have become addicted to and boozed by a little bit. We're a little bit doped by that concept. It's not necessarily the only way or even the best way to thicken and grow branches on deciduous trees. We can do it in a more sustainable manner.
All right. Up next is Treebeard Steve. They say that huge branch on the lower left is about half the girth of the trunk,
Yeah.
which is too thick to comply with most conventional guidelines. Do you intend to keep that size ratio to make the branch a particular feature of the tree and give it an individuality?
So it may not conform to bonsai standards as defined by the Japanese model, but neither would the dead sections of the tree. And here's what I know. What I know about deciduous trees is that all of them are going to rot from the inside out at some point in their life. And if you're going to show a deciduous tree at any sort of representation of an older stage of its life, chances are you're going to have deadwood and you're going to have hollows and you're going to have imperfections, right? So if this tree already is not conforming, that big branch over there, if you ever see a big, huge stately oak out in the field, some growing area, whether it's a European species or whether it's a North American species, You're going to see big abnormally sized branches. You're going to see proportions that are representing the different pieces of growth that have occurred over time and the generational production of that wood mass that's sustained and supported that tree. That branch is what gives this tree a tremendous amount of age, character, and uniqueness. To take this branch off, if I ever, and this was a big part of the discussion initially, to take this off is to strip this tree of its soul. It's to turn it into a tree that looks like every other tree and lose everything that's valuable about this piece, right? I hope it gets bigger. I hope it's the same size as the trunk someday. That would be very authentic if we start to look at some of the older growth pieces of deciduous material across the world. And I think, again, having the hollow, which was initially a dead section from, I would say, potentially damage or maybe poor pruning right here, and that connecting to the dead section up here, which is definitely reinforcing the multiple apice form that this tree has taken on. All of these are parts of the story that are adding to, I think, the authenticity and the unique aesthetic of this tree. Okay? But the way that it has been handled, this is what we're talking about not only aesthetically, but also from the pruning process, is defying what we have come to accept as the traditional methodology of allowing it to grow until it reaches some preordained girth, right? And then we have permission to prune it, and we deal with big, massive scars, and we deal with a really challenging effort to try and heal those scars, and then we have to grow out the next transition of taper, and you never get a finished tree. You never get a finished tree. So we're trying to dismantle that dogma in the same way that we did with the tertiary model of pruning last week on the Trident. There are other ways to handle deciduous trees aesthetically and horticulturally that can give you better results. That's the whole point that why we're diving into this, because you can go read any Bonsai Today or Kenbone translation, Bonsai Europe, Bonsai Focus, and you can get the kind of information that will perpetuate the common misunderstandings of deciduous handling and deciduous growth. You don't see that really bear fruit a lot. You don't see a lot of good deciduous trees. For as much information as we've digested, where are all of our wonderful deciduous trees? You know, like, we do need to ask ourselves that.
All right, our next question is from Maria. Maria says, when you put this tree in the greenhouse during the dormant season, does the supplemental light have any detrimental effect on the tree's sense of seasonality, or does it confuse the tree at all?
So it depends on the intensity of the light, and most of the time the intensity of the light is not significant enough to have the kind of negative impact that you're insinuating or speaking to. But if we were to keep it illuminated with grow lights, in the spectrums that really register as potential influential light, not the common LED or the fluorescence, but actual grow lights that are in the red-green spectrum of light, yes, that could very much throw off its dormancy. And in fact, you know, if you talk about the production of poinsettia or mums, and you get these flowering crops in the greenhouse production industry, you can really destroy an entire year of work just by the wrong application of light. I'm not worried about it for this tree. I'm not worried about it at all.
All right. Zoda wants to know, when was this tree last repotted, and how long before you think it will be repotted again?
Yeah, this tree has to be repotted next spring. It was repotted 4 years ago. The campestre specifically, so vigorous, so aggressive. It's actually cracked this pot, which, you know, this is just a standard Chinese production pot, not a bad pot, not necessarily the highest quality or the greatest pot, but I certainly didn't expect it to blow the pot apart. And unfortunately, when you start to get the kind of pressure, now when you look at this, this is a very, very finely ramified campestre compared to how they normally grow based on how it's been handled. This is, I would say, maximizing the tree's ability to give me the finest possible growth, just through the way I've pruned it and through the way I'm talking about handling it tonight, okay? As a result of that, when we see campestre, normally campestre is quite coarse, quite aggressive, quite strong, and you see that in the root system in terms of being able to actually physically crack that pot and start to change the behavior of the tree. Now, what I also recognize is that some of this tighter ramification is a definitive product of having left it in this pot a little bit longer than most people typically would, constricting that, causing the roots to scale, finding the space in the core and the sheen of the tree, much like we talk about with conifers, how we get coarser trees to start to give us a little bit more of a refined product, okay? But there is a threshold we've kind of hit that threshold. We do have some branches showing a little bit of weakening. We have a little bit of, not, I would say, significant dieback, but for example, this piece right here perished this year for no apparent reason. When we start to see some of these initial nuances, the loss of some branching for no reason, the weakening of specific areas that otherwise have enough sunlight and attention to have strength, that's when we know it's probably time. And this tree is showing me a few of those warning signs that I need to pay attention to and acknowledge and respect.
All right, up next is Treebeard Steve. They want to know if you have considered connecting the Earl at the top with the big Earl in the lower right to create a hollow trunk.
So these are connected through the center of the trunk, and there's probably some natural recession that's going to take place up along this upper lip, but it definitely goes all the way through. The water from the top ends out coming out the bottom. I don't want to connect this so that I'm going to have one whole side with a linear hollow running from the base to the tip. I find that to be an unattractive aesthetic. To have a hint here, to have exterior living tissue, to have a dead top that has some informal decay and rot, I think that's a better design aesthetic and a little bit more authentic. And that's a good shot of it where Jesus is at, because you do get to see that connection point. But I don't want to open this up. I don't want this to be a splayed open hollow all the way up, because it's linear. It's linear. It's not of interest. It's more interest to have a peekaboo, to have a story up here that connects to the peekaboo, and to call that the kind of vibe and aesthetic that we're seeking. I think so much we try to connect those pieces and we end up creating straight lines in our design that might be more detrimental than beneficial to the actual execution of the aesthetic. Okay. Now I have a question, and I've got a little bit of a sort of conundrum here as I'm looking at this, because this piece on the right over here, we were always constructing this piece, this branch down low here, to potentially replace this kind of big upright form over there. Now, maybe we go ahead and we prune and we reduce this piece right here, but it does open up a big hole in the design, and we have these apical pieces that are up top here that we've got to also respect the fact that those are creating the upper region of our trunk and of our tree. Okay, so as you're kind of watching, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to work this piece right here and some of these back pieces, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to prune this upper piece just to reduce and see where we can get in terms of pulling back some of this ramification and this length to get back to proportional branching. And once we've gotten this pulled back, I'm going to ask you, do we go ahead and cut this off here? And if so, how do we compensate for it? You can't just say yes. You have to say yes with a strategy for how we compensate for the loss of that piece in the greater canopy of the tree.
All right. Up next is Gary in New York, and I know we touched on this a little bit. Going back to the ceramic, why an unglazed pot? With this masculine of a tree, why not a rectangular pot, or at least an oval pot with a straight rather than curved sides?
Yeah, good question, Gary. Honestly, this is a matter of I didn't have anything else, which all of us have encountered. It's something that we've tried to avoid having that be the excuse of. But for this tree, I have to be honest with you, I've been waiting for a deciduous pot of the size that I could replace this with. It's just such a big pot and such a big tree. The roots are literally to the edge of the container in terms of the big, thick superstructure in the root zone. I don't know if I'll ever be able to reduce it to a smaller pot than this, although I would like to try. It would involve a grinder, potentially a chainsaw, and some fairly dramatic reduction of that tissue. If I can, I will, but right now it's not currently an option, or hasn't been at least the last time we repotted. So we'll see if things have changed.
All right. Up next is Marsha. They say that they adopted a good-sized hedge maple, but with large knuckles on ends of the main branches. When and how do you handle these? It looks like the tree may have had a similar situation prior to the lower large first branch. The tree is about 1/2 the size of the one you're streaming on.
Yeah. So you've got to prune those knuckles out, either back to buds that exist behind them, or you've got to cut them out so that you take out those knuckles. And there are a few knuckles that are occurring on the tips of these branches. Next to, here, let's take a look at this one, okay? Because I feel like this was something that I was just addressing, right? Where we have a prune. Yeah, that's beautiful, Jesus. That's wonderful. Okay, we have a prune. Let me go ahead and just, no. Yeah, there it is. Okay. Okay, we have a prune here that occurred, and we've got smaller piece here. We've got a smaller piece on the top. We've got coarser secondary ramification here. Okay, when you get into this instance or this scenario, you may choose to prune back all the way back into here and just cut that out, or you may need to come back in here and you may need to take out the piece that's causing some thickening on the top and the coarse piece that has the lesser degree of quality on the side, and get back to a bifurcation now where you have the ability to now lose that knuckle and really start to refine that transition of resource as it moves from the base to the tip of that branch. Very, very common, especially in such a vigorous tree. Again, I want to continue to reiterate, Acer campestre is incredibly strong and incredibly vigorous. And as a result, we are going to have areas that are going to excessively swell. We are going to have areas that are going to grow out of proportion. This is a part of dealing with vigor, right? We all want strong trees. We all want vigorous trees. Part of the problem with vigorous trees is you have to deal with the coarseness of vigorous trees. That means that we've got to very accurately be pruning those pieces to be able to empower ourselves to have that control over that growth and be able to rectify any of the structural issues that occur because of that vigor, right? So it's just a part of the game when we start dealing with really strong species.
All right. Up next, we've got Kip. Kip wants to know if you can define the lifespan of the tree as a bonsai because of the rot, and how long should you expect a tree of this type to last?
Kip's sitting right next to me here. But I appreciate you
Kip.
using the tools that we've provided you, Kip. Well done. Well done. Well done.
I had no idea Kip was
Oh,
sitting right there. Hi,
Kip's
Kip.
right here. Kip's right here in the workshop. Okay. So.
Do you want me to reread the question?
No, because I'm just going to ask Kip, the hollow, how old does it make it?
Well, not how long can you, the rot is going to keep continuing.
Uh-huh.
How long can you set up the life of this bonsai? If it's yours, are you expecting, like, in my lifetime, this will no longer be a bonsai?
Oh, okay. I got you. So Kip said, you've intentionally encouraged the rot. By encouraging that rot, how much have we potentially shortened the lifespan of this tree? Is this like a in our lifetime kind of a vibe that encouraging that rot? Can you stop the rot? Can you slow the rot now that you've started the rot? And is it going to detriment the eventual time frame and span this tree can exist? That rot is something we can control, right? Because we can go in, we can clean the pithy wood, we can go ahead and harden the wood, we could preserve the wood, we can do a lot of things to slow and stop that rot that we've kind of initiated in the core of the tree. And I think to add to the interest of age, one thing that we have to recognize is the only way rot takes down or destroys a tree is by weakening it structurally until it collapses. Well, that happens on a 30-foot tall, 80-foot wide coastal oak, right? Because the weight and the significance of that wood when it loses that structural member of the core will collapse. In a bonsai, it's very, very rare that we suddenly have a collapse of a trunk because it has rotted to the degree where the living tissue of a healthy growing tree cannot continue to replenish itself at the same rate that the interior core is rotting. I don't think I've ever actually seen that happen on anything other than a wisteria, where I really saw the rot go more rapidly than the growth of the living portion. Okay, so I'm not worried about it.
All right. Our next question is from Rafi. He wants to know, can you discuss the fertilizer regime applied last year to this tree as well as next year's?
The fertilizers. So I will be honest with you, this was just a moderately fertilized tree, and when we start to talk about fertilizer and moderate versus aggressive versus maybe even a low dosage, we're talking about quantity and timing. And I was very moderate with this tree because I'm building more than anything secondary branching. So if I aggressively fertilize this and all of a sudden I got this massive, massive blowout production, a big, thick, heavy growth, that's not doing me any good or working towards trying to create secondary expansion of scaffolding. And the addition of the twigs, even as I cut this back, the addition of the twigginess that's existing inside of this canopy, I'm really, really surprised and impressed with. And that's not tooting my own horn, because I didn't do it. The tree did it, right? I just didn't push it to a point where it was unsustainable or where I lost the value of that growth. And this is really where you have to ask yourself, in the creation of bonsai, what stage am I in? What am I trying to accomplish? What do I want this tree to be doing? Because most of us tend to fertilize with some notion that we're trying to get it to grow and grow and grow and grow. And that's not necessarily what makes the best tree or allows us to control the growth or allows us to refine a tree that we've gotten to a significant state of development or really enhance the quality of, and it's time to pull back on our kind of traditional or typical response to the fertilizing methodology. So this was moderate. I'll probably come back and fertilize it with moderate fertilization again in terms of every maybe 6 weeks and with a 1 tablespoon per location, moderate dosage, and call it good and let the tree continue to respond. Again, I'm also in that process, I'm not making big cuts back into the structure. So I do not expect this tree to give me some big nasty growth as a result of the work that's happening tonight. I plan on this tree behaving very, very well, very moderate, very calm, very measured in terms of its response to this kind of reduction. And assuming that's what happens, I don't want to speed that up. I don't want to cause that growth to become coarse. If I wanted that, I could cut this back more heavily and achieve it through the way that I cut back, or I could use fertilizer. If I'm smart in both regions, I maintain the continued forward progression of the kind of branching that I'm aspiring to build, right? And this is really, again, we tend to talk about grow it out, big, long, and strong, cut it back hard and heavy, heal the wound, grow in the taper again. Grow it out long and strong, cut it back, and it's like, when are you gonna stop this big, long internode, big, coarse branch, cut back, big wound, now I gotta heal it and grow in taper? You have to stop that process at some time. You have to get past that at some time, right? I would prefer to do that sooner than later.
Awesome. Well, we're all caught up on questions. Treebeard Steve and Raffi are both enjoying the odd proportions between the large trunk and the very first thick branch. They're saying you should definitely keep that.
Nice. I think to take it off for this tree, you would have a completely worthless tree. You know, and this is a controversial tree. This is a controversial decision. This is a controversial topic, right? Because there are going to be those of us out there that are like, oh, I do appreciate the traditional deciduous model. I have no beef with it. I have absolutely no beef with it. My only concern with a tree whose unique characteristic is a little bit more authentic to a more natural growth habit or a more aged proportion and representation of deciduous, right? Again, I will be very transparent that I think the Japanese model of bonsai taps into the teenage years of representation, and what we see, at least in North America and in a lot of parts of Europe, is you see old growth trees that far surpass that aesthetic in terms of how they're represented in the native environment. And then we get this piece of material and somebody cuts this big large branch off to make this conform to an aesthetic that doesn't have a representation in Japanese bonsai, but could have a representation in European or North American or Central or South American bonsai or Australian bonsai or South African bonsai. And all of a sudden we've tried to abide by something that is not representative or not even connected to our thought process, and you lose the quality of the tree. How many trees have you seen where branches have been cut with the notion that it was making the tree a more fundamentally better bonsai, and once that thing was cut off, you thought, wow, that really lost a lot. That really lost everything. That really lost what made it special. That really lost something that was spectacular. You know, and when you're the one that makes that move, when you cut that branch off, and that feeling afterwards where you go, wow, did I really let somebody influence me to the point that I just ruined what made this tree special? That's a pretty indelible mark that is made on your memory as a bonsai practitioner. I've had that happen a lot in my life, right? Okay, so I'm working through this, and here's the other thing, you know, as we talk about dividing up these branches. And again, deciduous work, starting this tonight, I think probably a lot of us were like, well, there's no way we're going to finish this. Oh no, we're absolutely going to finish this tree tonight. Okay, because deciduous work is not the same kind of massive wire lift that we have on conifers, especially at this point where it's already been wired twice, where we're already starting to establish such a good distribution and hierarchy amongst our branching, okay? Now we're just naturalizing this a little bit, okay? We started out a little bit more fundamental. Now we're naturalizing this a little bit. We're changing some of the proportions and scale, okay? This is a selective process. This is such a nice process to engage with. I really enjoy the deciduous model from this perspective, where we do get to have a lot more nuanced decision-making capacity in the creation of the tree, right? Because it allows us to be so much more intentional about the kind of division and shape and form without being so strict and regimented to be wiring every single piece. Okay, and so when we look at this, we're going to have probably 20% of the branches wired after this, and I would call 20% a really good proportion for this stage where we've primarily rectified the secondary issues of the design. We're starting to regain and kind of tap into a little bit more of a natural form, a little bit more of a softer representation, a little bit more of a proportional distribution, right? That feels right to me, and there's entire areas on this tree that don't even need any attention from the wiring perspective. They don't need that kind of information. They don't need that kind of reinforcement of shape and design. That means that we're getting there. That means that we're starting to have a positive influence and effect on the shape. We're speaking the same language, or at least the same conversation as the tree in terms of our mutual interpretation of what we're trying to accomplish.
LA David is requesting if we could see a close-up of the last piece that you just put wire on.
Last piece that I just put wire on, you got it.
Yep.
Okay, pretty big, pretty beefy wire. That's that 4.55, fairly significant.
Where?
Right here.
Okay.
Right here. Yeah, right there. Okay, that's where we put that wire, right? And, you know, there's a minimal wire scar kind of at the base of that, but other than that, it's relatively well, I would say, well-formed, well-shaped, okay? All right, and it's interesting, I'm just going to look past the camera behind you all, and it's interesting getting to see some of the space. Now, this is where we can start to integrate some of these branches here and some of these pieces into these open spaces. That open space right there, that needs a little bit of occupying. Because we took out the big branch that sat right here, now we get to move some of these pieces, and just stepping back for a moment, being able to look from a distance at this more sort of greater perspective of the tree does inform what we tend to do with design. Having that what would you call that? That awareness to just understand that we've got to move from the zoomed out to the zoomed in a lot during bonsai design, especially in a design where we're not trying to prune everything and we're not trying to wire everything, where we're really trying to make strategic decisions. A hole or a gap in the design like this, that's a really good moment to just assess design, figure out what we have with the capacity and the branching that still exists to be able to occupy those spaces and continue moving this forward. With the loss of these bigger, thicker pieces, we are going to have to reconcile the design because the tree has photosynthetically kind of dictated itself in the ability to grow unchecked for the past few years, and it has kind of created its own system to be able to utilize the space that it has and the branching that it can generate to build the best and the most efficient system. And we're changing that now. Again, changing it from a very measured way, but nevertheless, adapting and adjusting, okay? So just moving that into that space, we should start to see, there it is, right? Now we start to get a little bit of that in that depth, and that's gonna build over the course of time. I like that transition, okay? We've got a little bit more here that I think we want to keep up into this space. And then I think we start to bring this piece down and we start to really utilize these bigger structural elements a little bit lower. We're getting there. Let's come back. Let's come back to this piece right here, because I told you I was going to ask you, and now it's time. Do we want to try and reduce that or lose that, or do we want to keep that piece? On the right side and the upper right side, it does have kind of an offensive line, right? Up and into that space. Almost a little too long, but it's like it kind of feels like we need it. If we take it off, what do we put there? Gets a little funky, gets a little loose. What do we think? I need a little bit of feedback. I'll wait for your feedback. I'm thinking I want to cut it back to this piece right here, right? If we do cut it back, we lose all of that right there. Feels a little dangerous. Feels a little dangerous. I'll keep working on the upper part while we get your feedback on that. You still with me, Eve? Oh, we lost Eve for a sec. That's what was happening.
Rafi and Jerry, keep it. Kim says lose it. Roger says keep it. Let's see. Nathan says shorten it to finer laterals. David says keep it. Counterbalance to strength on the left.
So you cut out for a second, Eve?
Yes. Sorry, I'm back.
Okay, yeah, you're back. No, I got that you're back, but I didn't hear what everybody said.
Okay. They're saying, okay, so Rafi said keep it. Jerry said keep it. Kim says lose it.
Lose it.
Roger
Keep it,
says
keep it, lose
keep
it.
it for now.
Okay. Keep it, lose
Damien,
it, keep it.
yeah. Damon says short it to finer laterals. David says keep it. Counterbalance to strength on the left.
Do we want the counterbalance? This is the question, right? That is a very significant question. Do we want that counterbalance? Is that what we're after? Like, are we going for symmetry or are we going for a proximity to symmetry? I'm not saying there's a right answer. This is a deciduous, right? It does have a lot more cytokinin concentration. Cytokinin concentration equals potentially a little bit more of a domed out symmetrical form, although we recognize the random acts of nature do change that symmetry into an asymmetrical model with age. That's how we represent age. But we're also talking about something. A hedge maple is not going to be growing, at 10,000 feet of elevation in a rugged and arid landscape. That's going to potentially cause a lot more death and devastation and random acts that create that kind of asymmetry in deadwood. So we have to kind of buffer, right? We've got to find a little bit of a balance, a little bit of a middle ground when we start trying to represent age in deciduous trees. But they still, I've recently been turned on to the photography of Beth Moon. If anybody has ever seen Ancient Trees, her book, it's phenomenal. And she has photographed a lot of famous and fantastic trees around the world. But one of them that really struck me was just an incredible, incredible elm. And I believe the elm is from Europe. That was very, very moving to see that elm. Mainly because it just had such an irregularity, and it was in the splendid full-bore fall color. That was amazing to see. But its asymmetry was just spectacular. Really, really short on one side, big and long on another, massive trunk, hollowed out in the middle. And it was like, ooh, that's deciduous on another level right there. That's deciduous on a level that has not been represented in bonsai to date. And so when we start to talk about that and you're saying, hey, listen, counter to the other side, do we want that counter? That's the real question. And because this big branch is over here, I almost venture to say I'm not sure that I want to counter that. If we want to create value in this big branch, shouldn't we pull on the right side and push out on the left side? That's kind of where my mind is at. But again, I do respect that a lot of people are saying keep it. Because it might not be time, it may open up too big of a hole, it may cause something that I'm not necessarily thinking about. Conceptually, I want that asymmetry, okay? Now what I'm doing here is I'm just setting up a guy wire in the upper canopy of this because I do want to try and lower this just a little bit to get a little bit more bend, and this is a piece that I've lowered multiple times over the course of this tree's design. It continues to want to rise up because it's in the apex and phototropism. The desire to grow towards the sun is real. We've officially confirmed that scientifically that works. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to pull to one of the bigger pieces of wire here and hope that the whole system doesn't fall apart, okay? And the worst thing that could happen is if I broke this off of the tree. So let's hope that that doesn't happen, huh? And it's always difficult dealing with deciduous to start working with guy wires. Okay, but campestre is such a wonderfully, okay, and I'm not going to say it till I'm done. Campestre is such a wonderfully flexible maple. Very, very malleable in its ability to be kind of manipulated and handled and bent, which gives us the unique opportunity, and we saw this with the Yatsubusa elms as well. The cork barks and the Yatsubusa elms do have, or at least have historically for us, had a capacity to be heavily manipulated, adjusted, and changed in terms of wiring. But there are those deciduous trees that are really, really challenging to wire, that really don't flex, that don't conform. And I would say trident maples tend to be one of those. Japanese maples, another one, where they're very, very, very delicate when we start getting into the movement of their branching, okay? I like that. I like it pushed down a little bit, starts to compress that apical region a little bit. That feels better to me. In fact, I want to go further. If I can get this down further, that feels even better. Look at that. Yum, yum. Give me some. Let's see if we can get that.
Is that the next Mirai shirt? Yum, yum, give me
Yum,
some.
yum, yum, give me some. That's right. You said it, Eve.
I'm so sorry.
Do you wish you hadn't now?
No. I'm going to be getting requests in the forum though
Yeah,
right
you
away,
are.
I'm sure.
Black belt bonsai and yum, yum, give me some.
Yes. I got a question from Leonard. Leonard wants to know, will the foliage on the lower left branch and the foliage of the main trunk leave a large distracting hole?
Foliage on the lower left branch and the foliage where?
On the main trunk. It's foliage on the lower left branch and the foliage of the main trunk.
I don't think I quite understand.
I'm not sure either. Leonard, go ahead and send us an update if you want to clarify a little bit. Back to Kip in the studio. Speaking of the cut of despair, what has been one of your greatest bonsai design regrets?
My greatest bonsai design regrets. Well, there was a, that's funny. There was a limber pine that Randy had collected. Really beautiful, naturally beautiful limber pine. And I bought it from Randy. And I took it into his workshop before I ever owned Mirai. This was right when I came back from Japan. And I'm thinking, I've got to do something. I've got to make this tree a bonsai. I've got to make this tree spectacular. It was already spectacular. I didn't have to do anything. And so I'm bending it and I'm bending it and it doesn't look good. So I bend it some more and it doesn't look good. So I bend it some more and it doesn't look good. And then finally, we all know what happened. It snapped, right? The trunk broke in half. It was a totally dead tree. And Randy came out right when it broke in half. Snap, and I'm looking at it and it's kind of in two pieces. And Randy's looking at me and he's like, that was a really good tree. I said, I know. And he said, why do you think that you needed to do that? And I said, I don't know why I felt like I needed to do that. And he said, maybe you shouldn't do that next time. And I said, okay, I'll think about that. That was a real eye-opening time for me because Mr. Kimura was so hell-bent on manipulating everything that I really hadn't ever experienced a tree that was good that I didn't need to touch or I didn't need to alter in a significant way. At least I'd never been educated about that. That was a big design moment for me. And I think that changed everything about the way I go about design now because I'm not afraid to manipulate something, but I think that we have to be very cognizant of the fact in bonsai that you don't want to just manipulate for the sake of manipulating. You want to manipulate to improve. And that is something that I continue to try and be aware of. Maybe to the degree that my designs have become a little more passive, but I would say we're still probably pushing the envelope pretty good.
All right. Marty says, when repotting deciduous trees, is it acceptable to use pumice and lava in the soil to help with the balance of water and oxygen in humid portions of the country? What would this mix look like in order to still achieve a high level of ramification and not encourage coarse roots?
I don't think it's acceptable, no. Even though you're dealing in high relative humidity. I think deciduous trees love water. They move water rapidly. And therefore, we have to consider and work towards accommodating that water mobility and that water movement. And as a result, I think that we have to try and get the roots to scale. We need to use that moisture content that Akadama gives us. And that's really where I think you have the best possible outcome from the potting process and the scalability of the roots. I think lava and pumice being utilized in deciduous cultivation, I think in general is a mistake across the board. And you very rarely, if ever, have seen deciduous material that's been cultivated in a lava pumice mixture that reaches that highest level of ramifiable or ramified growth And that's a statement. That's an immediate discussion of the fact that that's not necessarily going to create the conditions and circumstances that allow you to reach that next level. So relative humidity or not, I still think akadama is your best bet, but you do have to be able to water the akadama appropriately. And let me go a little bit deeper on that, just in terms of deciduous cultivation as a whole, okay? When we talk about deciduous cultivation, a lot of people tend to blame akadama for missteps in their watering and their supplemental nutrition, but the bigger thing about akadama is when you transition to akadama, if we leave behind a lot of organic nursery soil, if we leave behind any clay from the field growing efforts, if we leave behind any of the nasty decomposed peat, if we leave behind any of the pumice and lava in the core and then we put akadama around it, any of the things that we do when we maybe underdo, instead of overdoing, underdoing, or be too conservative in a deciduous repot, that can be the cause of the problems, not the akadama, but the discrepancy of the water-oxygen balance throughout the consistency of that container. And then we look at it and we say, well, this tree was very healthy growing in pumice and lava, or growing in peat, or growing in whatever soil it was in that it didn't succumb to or show any negative effect from. And, this whole akadama business is all, a bunch of hogwash or something. Okay, that's fine, right? But was it the technique or was it actually the akadama? Most of the time, it's the technique that fails when we start to talk about those moments where akadama sort of doesn't perform as we would expect, or a tree doesn't perform as we would expect from the utilization of akadama. So I throw that out there because I think there's a lot of cause and effect discussion about akadama, but akadama will not compensate for poor technique. And if you know how to water and cultivate a deciduous tree, you could probably build a good deciduous tree in almost any soil structure, but akadama makes it the easiest, makes it the simplest build, okay? I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to drop this down, because this dropping down, if we can get this down, is definitely going to influence whether or not we keep this piece that we've been sort of asking ourselves, do we need it or do we not? Okay, it's coming down. What do we think about that? A little bit more compact, a little bit more compressed. I like that. We've gotten a little bit more bend here, which is nice. We've got some upper pieces here. I feel like we can go a little bit more, and then I almost feel like we do have the capacity to reduce that over there. I don't know yet. I don't want to make the bold claim we're going to, but I feel like we're headed in the right direction. Let's go a little bit more here and just see what we can get out of this. Okay.
You ready for some questions?
Give me 1 second. Yeah, I'm ready.
All right. Jared wants to know, is deadwood on a deciduous like this ever acceptable? I remember growing up, we had a maple that had lots of deadwood at the top because of a bug infestation. It added some cool character to the tree.
Yeah, so again, I think like from the traditional sense, is it acceptable? No. From the practical sense, is it acceptable? Yeah, it's maybe the most accurate representation is to have deadwood in a deciduous tree. So it just depends. Is your value system of aesthetics built around the traditional model, or are you trying to represent a more natural phenomenon? Because I think it's completely acceptable. And that's really where you do talk about the older iterations. If the Japanese model is kind of representing a little bit more of a younger iteration or rendition of a tree, there's still all of those other older iterations and renditions that we have yet to represent or see represented. And that's where deadwood, I think, does play in to a significant degree to the aesthetic of deciduous trees, and not in terms of the gin, not in terms of dead branches. I don't think that that's a very good aged representation, because typically deciduous wood does have a very soft characteristic and is relatively rot prone. But that's where the hollow trunk, I think, comes in as an aesthetic that we could see more of or anticipate as being a part of older versions and aesthetic iterations of deciduous trees.
Bentley is requesting if you could put a towel on the branch that you're thinking of cutting.
Yeah. Yeah, I need to do that too, Bentley. I'll do that in just 1 second. Because we're talking about cutting it off, and that means it doesn't get to come back. Let me see what I got here. Awfully big towel, but let's see what we get here. Now I sandwich this all down on top of myself, so. See, I think that's got to go. I just have to say, look at the push that happens to the right or to the left now when you take this off. It's almost like this is the upper counter to that. Do you see that? It does have a very countering effect.
You've got Kim and Linda in the chat all saying yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, okay, all right. I think it's the right move. I could be seeing this incorrectly, but I think it's the right move. And here's the other thing, is I think it facilitates, okay, here we go.
Hold your breath.
Oh, see, that was the move. That was the move.
Beautiful.
That's great. That's great. Okay, here's what else I think. I think in the removal of this, I think it facilitates a much healthier branch down here, but that push to the left, this is far more, because that was a counter to this piece here, right? And now that we've gotten that out of the way, I love what just happened. Okay, cool. Good job, Linda.
Returning back to Leonard's question from earlier, he said that you were addressing the gap with small branch reallocation, but he says it still looks like a large hole. I think they're referring to the left area.
Yeah, right in here. Yeah, there's nothing I can do about that. I can develop this piece now, right? And again, we talk about, so everybody needs to maintain perspective. This tree came out of the field roughly, I'm gonna say, 6 or 7 years ago as a completely raw stump out of Randy's field. Yeah, this is light speed. What we've built on this tree in a short period of time, this is almost unheard of. So when you think about this, just understanding that the process with deciduous, you're talking 10, 12, 15 years before you even have something that remotely resembles a deciduous tree. And then you start to add on to that to gain the quality and the aesthetic. We're way ahead of schedule. But these areas where we start to cut things out and we start to occupy and fill, that's the next phase of building, right? We got the secondary scaffolding via the way that we handled it and the wiring process we applied. Now we're at a point where we're starting to maneuver through some of these other iterations and building and construction projects. And it's gonna take it a while. It's gonna take it a considerable amount of time to get where we want it to go. And we just have to be patient. We have to know the process, we have to understand the process, and we have to be patient in the process.
All right. We've got a question from Sarah. What would your dream pot for this tree look like?
Oh, man. I mean, I think a really beautiful horsed rectangle, cut corner, deep horsed blue would just be the cat's meow for this tree. And I don't know if he still throws that big. There was one big, beautiful, dark rectangle that was kind of greenish blue in this last firing that we offered online. And Troy has a really beautiful pomegranate that we looked at it for, and it was just a little bit too small. And obviously this tree is gigantic, so the pot would have to be very, very big in order to suit the needs of this tree. But I continue to hope, because we do have one of his big, really beautiful fluid ovals that we put the Mary Madison bald cypress in. And so I every time that we get a box from Horst and we're opening it, I'm hoping that piece for this tree is in there. Gonna keep hoping. Just a really beautiful deep blue. I could also see, and I'll say this, I could also see a more orangish yellow with this tree as well. It wouldn't be as bold, but it would be beautiful, and it would also be a nice counter to the power, to the visual power of this tree as an analogous composition that could be quite moving. I could see that working really well.
We got another question from Kip. They want to know, how would you make a switch to Akadama? Anderson flat and development time, or only for the first repot forward?
So with deciduous, there are very few deciduous that cannot be bare rooted in the repotting process. And I'm not saying that you want to bare root every time, but I think when you're trying to make a transition, the bare rooting process to get rid of the old soil underneath the trunk specifically is an important aspect of changing out and setting up Akadama to be successful in the future cultivation of that tree. And I think that is the big move where people tend to be fairly hesitant in the repotting process, and the move towards pumice and lava and the water dynamic that creates as a different sort of value system to what the tree historically has had is really where we get into some pretty gnarly dynamics and some pretty iffy horticultural boundaries. To go ahead and wash, bare root, and really clean out the underside, clean out the interior, and reset that tree is important. Now I'm talking about deciduous, and specifically true deciduous, in terms of broadleaf deciduous, not deciduous conifers, because contrary to popular belief, you would never ever want to wash and bare root a bald cypress or wash and bare root a pond cypress or a dawn redwood, right? Even though they're deciduous conifer. The coniferous nature of that is to say it is a bad practice, and it is an unpredictable and unsustainable practice to bare root a larch, a dawn redwood, or a bald cypress. But when we talk about broadleaf deciduous, that's definitely a methodology that we can utilize to our benefit to reset the soil system and allow ourselves to have success in the transition to Akadama.
Okay, up next is Gary. Gary says, I think the brand, or sorry, no, that was from before. My apologies. Up next is Zoda. Zoda says, have you ever made root cuttings from campestre, and do you know if it really works?
Ooh, I've never made root cuttings from campestre. I don't know if it works. I definitely, obviously, the most common root cutting species, pyracantha, do it well, and Chinese elms do it really well. Redwoods also do it incredibly well, but I've never tried it with a campestre. I have no idea. But that's interesting. I like that suggestion, and I think it's something that you should potentially explore, because that could be pretty epic.
Up next is Big Mike. Big Mike says, if I use 100% Akadama, it would turn into mud fairly rapidly based on 35 experience in the hot, humid South. What might you recommend for somebody growing deciduous in this area where Akadama breaks down so quickly?
Well, I don't think it's the fact that Akadama breaks down so quickly. It's the quality of Akadama, I would say. And there are definitely quality of Akadama or low quality Akadamas that will break down that quickly anywhere. Pacific Northwest, northeastern United States, southeastern United States. It's not, Akadama is not a product of humidity. If you've ever been to Japan, Japan is ridiculously humid, ridiculously hot, and they still find Akadama to be the soil medium of choice, right? So we have to understand what the nuances are. A lot of the Akadama imported into North America, unfortunately, and this is not to out any Akadama importers, I'm not saying any brands or any names or anything like that. Unfortunately, a lot of the Akadama imported does tend to be quite cheap, quite low quality, because the markup on the Akadama and the margins on it are really good, right? And if we assume that Akadama is Akadama, then we might get ourselves into a position where we're using an Akadama that's not that favorable, right? And we have to understand too that in Japan, Akadama as a generic term is incredibly readily available, and in fact they pot their house plants in Akadama. Right now, is it a high quality Akadama? No, their house plants aren't potted into the same quality of Akadama as Mr. Kimura would be using on his priceless clients' bonsai trees. But it's still called Akadama. So if you take that Akadama and you import it here, and then you put your tree in it in the southeastern United States, it's going to turn to mush, but it's not the Akadama that's the problem. It's the quality of the Akadama, and it's the generic utilization of the term Akadama that's the issue.
All right. Up next is Sarah. Sarah was curious if you said how long this was field grown for,
Oh, I
or
think
the
this
age overall.
was, I think this was 10 or 11 years that this was field grown for. Randy, and I've said this before, with the loss of Telperian Farms, which was super gnarly for our bonsai community, because we all, really appreciated and respected Chris and Lisa and the work that Gary had done there. That was tough, but I've also said it's unfortunate. A lot of people don't realize how good of a field grower Randy Knight was, because everybody tends to I think, celebrate his Yamadori collecting skills. But Randy was a tremendous field grower and probably produced the best deciduous material as well as the best field-grown larch, as well as some pretty spectacular field-grown pine in his field. And when you don't give the kind of support that's necessary to keep an operation like that alive, the reason that his field stopped was he just couldn't make ends meet. There wasn't enough business, so he moved strictly to Yamadori collecting, which none of us can complain about, but also it's a shame because this was, I would say, a very mediocre Acer campestre at best coming out of his field. He had far superior pieces. Okay, starting to get there, nice and interesting, right? And let me just take a little bit of a zoomed out perspective, and I'm actually going to step back to where you all are. There's a few more pieces of wire, but we are close. We are really, really close. And I like the craggly nature of what we have going on here. Now I'll go ahead and I'm going to reduce the apex on this right side here because we have such a kind of irregularity. Maybe we need to shrink a little bit down and compress, and then we need to reconcile this area right here. There's some overlapping and there's some undecided areas. But for the most part, this has been a real nice sort of reassessment of proportion, shape, and design. And it feels good. It feels really good. I've been looking at this tree waiting to do this piece of work with the month of maples. It just felt right to come back to this notion. And seeing the scale of the tree change, seeing the size of the tree grow with the way that we're orienting the pads is pretty cool. It's a tool that you can all apply openly and broadly to your trees. And it doesn't necessarily have to be something that differentiates traditional from if we're attempting to do a more natural representation. This can just simply be a commonly designed or commonly accepted and applied design nuance to play with proportion as a tool that exists in our design toolbox.
Sarah's requesting another slow rotation.
You bet.
And we've got some other questions.
Let me go ahead and
give us that rotation.
Go ahead and rock. Well, let me finish this first.
Oh, sorry, my bad. I didn't see you actively wiring. My apologies.
Are you on the delay?
I'm on the delay, so I hear you accurately, but I see you at the same time everyone else does. So I just have a slight visual delay.
The delay.
I got a question from Michael. Michael wants to know: would you treat a linden tilla cortata in the same way, akadama only?
I would. Yes, definitely. In fact, if you check out AJCPA on Instagram, there is the linden that we did the big styling on at Mirai has been continued with the expert hand of Adam Johnson, who's a really good student, and to see that tree flourishing like that is just magic. That tree is in solid akadama. So there's a really good example of linden, both in its evolution, very rapid evolution, as well as sort of the fruits of akadama and the creation of that scalable root system. The ramification enhancement on that tree, which was done on the stream, I believe, spring of 2018, and where it's at now, fall of 2020, is shocking. I mean, absolutely shocking. And it just goes to show, it's a continual reinforcement, right? It would be different if I was standing up here without the ability to show the progressions, right? But thankfully, technology's empowered us to be able to visually see what the heck we're talking about. And it's pretty powerful to see the deciduous evolution that is taking place on some of these pieces that have been worked on. Just not as a way to be overly confident, but as a way to be responsive to either the failure or success of our hypotheses in the pursuit of bonsai. And I'm quite happy with where we're headed deciduous-wise. I think it's going to be very, very powerful as we continue to improve.
Let's see. Kathy and Kim are saying that they're looking at the straight line that your eye is drawn to down to the left. Do you want to try to work some irregularity into that side?
Let me just see what they're talking about here.
Let me see if I can find any more reference also.
Straight line. There's still some improvements to be made on this tree for sure, right? We're just getting in there, and there probably are a little bit of structural, but once I'm done with this, I'm going to move this out, and then I'm going to step back and we can kind of look at it from a few different perspectives and angles.
Touching back on Akadama, Danny says, should we be looking for a premium brand in Akadama, and what is a premium brand?
Should we look for a premium brand Akadama? Akadama, this is such a difficult discussion.
Yeah, Treebeard Steve also is asking for sources of high-quality Akadama in the U.S.
I understand. Here's what everybody has to understand about Akadama. The Akadama market in Japan is constantly changing, constantly going out of business, constantly exchanging ownership and hands. And the brands that we've commonly accepted as good Akadama might not be good anymore. The brands that we might not know about might be better, might be worse, might be commercial, might be reinventions of older brands. It is a very, I would say, fickle and constantly shifting industry that is Akadama. And so it's tough. It's tough for me. It's tough for me to keep track of. It's very dangerous, I think, to comment on without having kind of an acute awareness of it, and inside of that, I tend to shy away from that conversation. I think one thing that we can look at when you're talking about Akadama is how much dust is at the bottom of the bag when you buy a bag of Akadama. That's a very important thing to assess and to take a really good, hard, solid look at. Is the more dust that's on the bottom of the bag, the softer the Akadama is, and the more that's crushing just through the passive act of transportation. And so recognizing that, we can flip a bag over when you buy it, take a look at it, order every kind of Akadama, and see which one arrives in the best possible condition. There's some litmus tests that we can kind of dive into and dig into a little bit that definitely allow us to make an educated decision. Okay, so I'm recognizing as I step back, the straight line that you're talking about is right here, okay? And I'll just go like this, okay? And you kind of see that? I see that. So let's see what happens, and I'm just looking past the camera. As we start to rotate, okay, it's interesting to bring that hollow a little more towards the front. It takes the big branch away. And let's go ahead and just give you a full 360 rotation. Okay, because there is kind of a nice distribution of branching, and we could lower the apex a little bit more. I'm very tempted to lower the apex a little bit more, right? But we're starting to see, look at the proportion of that big, big branch. God, it's so awesome. So incredibly awesome. Okay, now I like this. There is some interest here. Now the hollow is all the way over here. The base is a little bit off center. Okay, and as we start to come around, there's some interest there. That takes away some of that straightness. Now, as we continue to circle back, now you see that straight line there and you see that space. It's interesting to get that depth of those branches, right? Right back in here, where we start to see a little bit more of that. We would have to tweak the apex to play in this region, but I think there's opportunity. I like to see that hollow, though. That has a significant feature, and as we continue to go, we change things. There's a lot of future exploration to be done in this tree. And again, let me just see if I can get the apical regions down. If I broke these off now, I would be forever bummed. Okay, there's one. Let me see what I can do for two. Oh, see, it's getting better and better. The lower it goes, the better it gets, because it's starting to occupy some of that space. Okay, and then we can take some of these pieces.
Oh, that looks much nicer.
Does look better, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Eve.
Anytime.
Yeah, that's good. Okay. All right. I'm going to call it for tonight. I feel really good with that. Okay, and again, you know, if we just talk about sort of the general state of things, we were able to stimulate such a significant expansion of branching that it really gave rise to the capacity to play on proportion, right? And we did so by even sort of violating the commonly thought approach to let's grow everything to the thickest possible point and then cut back and heal and regrow and taper and stuff, right? We're going to build it slowly. We still have more things to thicken. We still have more branching to enhance. We've given it a lot more directional push. We've taken advantage of that character branch and all of the characteristics that give this tree a big, grand scale. But there's more. There's more growth. There's more development. Deciduous trees, I feel more than any other tree or genre of bonsai are never done because there's always something that can be a little bit better, a little bit better, a little bit better. Very rarely do you hit it and say it's perfect. When you hit that moment, sell that tree, okay? I'm glad that we got to go through the month of maples. We hit tridents, we hit Japanese maples in 2 different developmental states, and now we were able to just attack the nuance of proportional creation of scale. This is really the most thorough that we've been about maple work, especially at this pivotal point in the fall where we have the capacity to really do a lot of significant shaping, design, pruning, and alteration. Next comes the repotting season and how we handle these maples to put them in the best position to be successful in the potting process. We're going to take you there, we're going to use these trees, and we'll walk you through all of that as well, just so that we make sure that we understand maples through and through from the fall to the spring work. But if there are any more questions, we should address those at this moment.
Sure. We actually don't have any more questions, but Josh has a before photo ready for you if you want to go give us a quick transition.
Let's see it, Josh. Oh. Yes, yes, yes. Very nice. Very nice. Now bring us back in studio. Oh, this is scrumptious. Yummy, yummy, yummy. I love it. Great, great, great. I saw this tree as a big stump, and I thought someday I hope that becomes a worthy bonsai. And slowly but surely, we are taking that journey. You all get to be a part of it. Check out the older video if you want to see how this thing started in the very beginning. But thank you all. Have a great rest of your night. We love you. Bye. Mwah!